I wasn't invited to my sister's company anniversary, even though my husband now owns the damn thing. That sentence kept playing in my head, like a joke only I understood. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and we stepped onto the top floor. James, slightly behind me, his steps quiet but steady. Everything smelled like polished wood lemon cleaner and ambition. I could feel the weight of the space all glass and chrome, the kind of place designed to remind you you don't belong. I used to shrink in places like this. Not today. The receptionist didn't look up when we passed her. The assistants glanced sideways, then back at their screens. I caught one of them whispering into a headset. They didn't expect me. No one had sent me an agenda. No one had CC'd me anything. But I had the time. I had the documents. I had the right to be here even if they didn't think so. The conference room was already full when we walked in. Men in slim suits. Women in tailored dresses with hair that said, "I don't run late." All eyes turned when James stepped inside, wearing his usual pressed button-down and quiet shoes. Not a janitor's uniform, but he still carried the aura they hated, calm, unreadable, unbothered. Then there was Veronica, my sister, CEO, queen of this floor, this table, this world. She didn't stand, she didn't even fully turn, just shifted her chair a few inches and tilted her head like she was reacting to a strange smell. "Well," she said, her voice slicing the air, "you came to beg for your janitor." A few polite laughs followed, not loud, not brave, just enough for her to hear and feel affirmed. James said nothing. He just opened his folder with a quiet rustle and slid it across the table. I stood beside him, placed my hand flat on the edge of the folder, like I was steadying the room. "No," I said. "We came so you could finally look at yourself." Silence. Even the assistant stopped typing. Veronica's face didn't move, but something in her jaw ticked. She looked at the folder like it might bite. "What is this?" she asked, not reaching for it. "A breakdown," I said, "of every acquisition your board approved in the last quarter, including the silent buybacks, including the shell company transfers. It's all there. And who's behind them?" James met her eyes just once, then looked away. Calm, like he'd been waiting for this longer than anyone in the room. "How," she said, barely above a whisper. "How did you—" She didn't finish. Couldn't, because she already knew the answer. I'd sat through years of family dinners where I wasn't invited. I'd answered texts that never got replies. I'd been told to be grateful, to be quiet, to not embarrass the family by marrying someone beneath me. But the truth is, I never fell beneath them. They just never bothered to look down far enough to see where I was standing. And now they would have to look up. James didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just sat and let the silence settle, let the papers speak louder than any defense he could give. I could feel the air shift the way people started to glance at him, then at me, then back at the file. Doubt spread fast in rooms built on pride. And nothing weakens pride like realizing you've underestimated the quiet ones. Outside the window, the skyline stretched wide and golden. Morning sun bounced off every steel beam. The city hummed like it always did, unaware that inside this perfect boardroom, the balance of power had tilted. They'd mocked me for marrying a janitor. They'd pitied me, warned me, left me off the guest list. And now, without a single raised voice, without a single apology, they were realizing they'd missed something. Someone. "How could this possibly happen?" Veronica asked again, this time to herself. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Her voice had already cracked beneath the weight of her own question. And in that silence, I remembered. I remembered being 8 and learning how to be small in my own house. Veronica was 17 then, glorious, gifted, already walking in heels and winning debates. She turned down a scholarship to Columbia to stay home with me after the accident. People called it brave, selfless, and it was at first. But over time, her sacrifice became a currency, something I owed her for permanently. Every time I missed a curfew, it was, I could have been in New York right now. When I chose English over finance, it was, you think poems can pay rent? And when I dared to love someone who didn't come with pedigree or pre-approval, it was, after everything I gave up for you, this is who you choose. There was no screaming. Veronica never screamed. She weaponized sighs, perfected disappointment. Her love was never in question, it was just conditional. And I lived like that for years, trying not to add weight to her already burdened shoulders, playing the good girl, the easy sister. I didn't talk back. I didn't ask for things. I tried to be the kind of gratitude she could show off. But there were cracks even then. I once overheard her crying in the kitchen. I was 12. She thought I was asleep. A voicemail was playing on repeat, some man saying, "Sorry." He'd sounded gentle, nervous. I didn't understand the words, but I remembered how she stood completely still, not even wiping her tears, just letting them fall like she didn't notice. The next morning, she threw away an entire box of letters and burned some photos in the backyard. Later, she told me men like that were a waste of time. That softness was weakness. That ambition was the only armor worth having. Veronica learned to control everything. Her image, her tone, me. She built herself into a fortress, then forced me to live in the basement of it. Always sheltered, always protected, never free. People praised her for raising me. But no one asked what it meant to be raised like that. I remember the day she came home with her first bonus check. She waved it like a trophy and said, "This is what real love looks like, security." I was 16, writing poems on receipt paper, and I smiled. Because I was supposed to. Because it was her world. I was just a thank you note in it. Over the years, I tried to break out gently. Chose different schools, different friends. But every time I stepped too far, she reeled me back in with guilt. Not threats, never threats. Just perfectly phrased reminders of how much I cost her. So when I met James, quiet, unreadable, James, I kept it to myself for weeks. He was a janitor. That's what the world saw. But I saw the way he noticed details, how he listened without rushing to speak. He never asked what I did, never judged my silences. It felt like walking into a room and not needing to apologize for being in it. When I told Veronica, she laughed. That low metallic laugh she saved for things she thought were beneath her. A janitor. It wasn't a question. It was an assessment, a diagnosis. That's when I knew nothing would ever be enough. Not my degrees, not my good behavior, not even my loyalty. And still, I stayed in touch. Answered every birthday text. Showed up to Christmas even when James wasn't welcome. I bent myself around her expectations until I nearly broke. But something shifted the day James looked at me and said, "You don't owe anyone the story they wrote for you." He didn't say more. He never does. And now, here we were in her boardroom with her voice finally shaking. She built her empire out of fear. She built me out of guilt. And now she was watching both foundations crack. I could almost feel sorry for her. Almost. But not quite. Because before I could feel sorry for her, I had to remember the man she mocked like a punchline, James. The first time I saw him, he was buffing floors in a downtown building where I was teaching a weekend workshop. Most people walked past without looking. He didn't speak much, and when he did, it was never small talk. Just a quiet nod, a steady hand pulling equipment behind him. But there was something in the way he moved, deliberate, unhurried, as if he refused to be rushed by anyone else's pace. Like he had nothing to prove. And that was what made him impossible to ignore. He didn't scan me like others did, sizing me up, filtering me through categories. He just looked. Not long, not intense, just enough to make me feel seen, not evaluated. It was unnerving, then oddly comforting. I made the first move, which surprised even me. Asked him if he wanted coffee. He said no, but thanked me sincerely. It took 2 more weeks before he said yes. We sat on a bench behind the building. He didn't ask about my job, my family, or my plans. Just talked about the shape of cities, how they change when no one's looking. I didn't realise until later that he never said anything about himself. We didn't date like normal couples. There was no candlelight, no Instagram, just walks, quiet meals. He listened better than anyone I'd met, but when I tried to dig into his past, he'd smile and change the subject. Not evasive, gentle. Like he knew what I was asking, but wasn't ready to hand it over. At first I thought it was caution. Later, I'd learn it was discipline. My co-workers didn't get it. Lana especially. She was a single mum with a sharp wit and sharper opinions. "You could do so much better," she'd said one Friday. "I mean, Janitor, is this a phase or a pity project?" She meant it as a joke, or claimed she did. But the way she said it, the sideways glance, the careful tone told me she believed it. James never responded to things like that. He didn't flinch. He'd just raise an eyebrow and say, "Some people clean buildings, others leave messes." Lana didn't like him, which meant in her world he was suspect. But there was someone who did see him. Really see him. Hank. Hank was the oldest janitor in the rotation. Quiet too, but not like James. More grandfatherly. He watched everything, spoke only when necessary. One evening, as I waited for James in the lobby, Hank sat down beside me. He didn't introduce himself. Just said, he used to wear suits every day. Not these blue ones. I looked over confused. He had people working for him. "You'd never guess, would you?" I asked him why he gave it up. He shrugged. Sometimes peace is worth more than pride. After that, Hank became a fixture. He never offered more than a hint, a sideways reference. But I understood he knew something, and he chose to let James reveal it on his own time. That meant more to me than any resume could. And James, he remained the same. Unchanged by whispers, undeterred by judgment. He never tried to impress anyone, least of all me, and that's what impressed me most. Even on our wedding day, if you could call it that, there were no guests, no flowers, no Instagram filter, just City Hall and 2 signatures. He didn't offer a ring, just held my hands and said, "I don't have much, but what I do have, you'll never have to earn." That night, Veronica sent a 1-line email. "I hope you know what you're doing." I didn't respond, but sitting here now, watching her blink too fast, trying to stay composed while James stood at the head of her boardroom, I realised I did know what I was doing. I had known the moment he chose silence over spectacle, over and over again. The memory of that first dinner still clamours in my mind. Sharp edges, flashing lights, the stale hum of composure. Veronica's condo is cathedral quiet, marble floors and breathing walls. The dining table stretched in cold symmetry, cushioned chairs, parked precisely around it. I set down a dish. I'd brought nothing fancy, just my attempt at warmth. James, in his neatly pressed shirt, cleared his throat and smiled. He didn't say much, but his hands were steady as he poured wine. Veronica watched him, head tilted, lips curved in a poised smile. Midway through the appetizers, Veronica leaned forward, eyes flicking from plate to man. She raised her glass, slightly, lips curved like a blade, and asked James, "So do janitors get benefits these days? Or are you doing this out of, character building?" It hit me like a slap made of glass. Time slowed. My fork stopped at my lips. I heard a faint pop of cork across the room. No one laughed. No one spoke. James didn't recoil, didn't even pause, but I saw the very slightest tremor in his hand when he placed the wine glass back. That hesitation whispered louder than any outburst. I forced a laugh, a tremulous, brittle sound, and said something lame about how he preferred title or not he could fix anything. Veronica tilted her chin and changed the subject, but the knife penetrated the room. You could taste it in the air. The rest of the meal passed in porcelain silence. Plates emptied, chairs scraped. We were seen, but not respected. Later in the car, the city lights blurred past the window. I tried to apologize. "I'm sorry. It wasn't." But James didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the road. I turned the radio on to something meaningless. When we pulled up, he gave my hand a soft squeeze and whispered, "Don't just hate her. Feel it if that's what you need." And he walked inside without looking back. That week, silence arrived like a tidal wave. Group messages I used to read became archives. Friends stopped checking in. Veronica's social media bookended each post with elegant soirees I wasn't invited to. Family celebrations rolled past me like silent films. Thanksgiving, mountain hikes, Christmas brunches, fall festivals. All photographs, all smiles, my absence glaring. Once I saw a photo of a cabin in Vermont, Veronica's golden family, bundled in matching scarves. I checked no notification, no invite. I stared at the image until late heart pounding in betrayal. I showed James the picture. He softened the screen and said, "We still have soup tonight." I didn't need more explanation. A co-worker, Lana, started crossing me off her inside jokes. At lunch, "Good for you, having a janitor husband. I hope the romance doesn't expire with his shift." I felt the words propelling shrapnel into me, but I swallowed them, tried to dignify the moment. At home, I told James everything, voice trembling, tears pooling. He took my hand and said quietly, "Let them define themselves, not us." The cold seed of doubt began to grow. It nestled in me at odd hours the midnight light. The silence of the apartment after I closed my laptop. The echo of Veronica's question. Was I delusional, clinging to a fairy tale that everyone else saw as a joke? Was James enough, really? I asked him once during a late night. "Do you ever regret choosing me when you could be someone else's star?" He looked at me in the dark and said, "I married the right person." That answer should have stopped the questions. It didn't. A storm rolled in one night fast, without warning. Rain pummeled the windows, shaking curtains and rattling the glass with its weight. I was grading papers, listening to the rhythmic patterns of citation errors, when the door swung open, and in walked James Walter, cascading off him. His jacket clung to his torso, dripping onto the rug. When he shed it, we discovered his boots were soaked through. He stood shoulders, heavy head bowed slightly. "Pipe burst at 7B, he said, voice quiet, uniformly dull. No one else showed. They turned off the water. Tenants flooded. I waited. That patience sank into me with aching clarity. I grabbed a kitchen towel, A thick one, frayed at the edges, wrapped it around his drenched hair. I knelt behind him, drying his scalp inch by inch, careful as if the rain could have soaked deeper than his uniform. He closed his eyes. I traced the faint scar behind his ear, something I'd never noticed, a small fold of memory and secrecy. Neither of us spoke. The storm outside roared. Inside, the silence held us not as a barrier, but as refuge. I felt warmth in that silent act, the simple, slow drying, like we were washing away everyone else's judgments. He sat with me afterward by the window, holding a mug of tea that steamed into the chill. I asked no questions, I made no demands. I just sat, watching the rain pound the city. Finally, I asked, "Why do you do it?" He stared into the middle distance. Because I saw someone small once and helped her grow. Now I don't have to prove anything to them or anyone else. That was his confession. Not loud, but seismic. I realised then that the storm outside mirrored one inside me. Chapters of loyalty, unravelling honour, tested. I sensed what was coming the night I might break. Sources of noise. Veronica's disdain, the families turning backs. The outsider jokes at work, they shrank beside that moment. Not because the moment was perfect, but because it held truth. He didn't need applause. He needed presence, and that night, I had it. And slowly, I knew storms like Veronica's would come back. But they wouldn't humble us. We knew who we were, and that knowledge would be our fortress. But sitting here now, watching her blink too fast, trying to stay composed, while James stood at the head of her boardroom, I realised I did know what I was doing. I had known the moment he chose silence over spectacle, over and over again. He needed presence, and that night, I had it. And slowly, I knew storms like Veronica's would come back. But they wouldn't humble us. We knew who we were, and that knowledge would be our fortress. So, when the party rolled around a glitzy company event full of pinstripe suits and hollow laughter, I felt ready. But the moment I announced James as my partner, I felt the invisible hush ripple through the crowd. I smiled at Veronica, hoping for warmth. Instead, her eyes lit with amusement, not at James, but at what she thought I represented. I felt my heart sink. That night, I cried in the bathroom afterward, tears slamming into the porcelain sink. When I came out, he was waiting. I said into his coat, "I can't take their looks anymore." He said nothing. He only stood behind me, letting me lean into his chest like a child drowning. Silence stretched 3 long days. No goodnight kiss. No gentle touch. I felt abandoned in the space between us. Each night I stared at the ceiling, replaying every glance, every whisper, every laughter that wasn't meant for me. I questioned everything. Was I foolish, too idealistic, clinging to a story everyone else called fantasy? 3 days later, I found an envelope on my pillow, heavy cream-coloured paper, with my name scrawled in his precise hand. Inside a single line, "If you want to leave, I won't stop you." That line shattered something inside me. It was mercy and verdict. I held it close like a relic. Night turned into morning. I didn't respond. I didn't even touch it. I slipped it into a drawer and left it there, untouched but always waiting. A week later was my birthday. Rain drummed on the window pane like muffled applause. I woke to an empty apartment and silence so loud it felt violent. I checked my phone compulsively. No social media notifications, no cards. I remembered past birthdays, extravagant parties, perfumed surprises, forced smiles. None of them felt real. At noon, I found a cupcake. James bought, frosting melting pinpoint candles flickering. I sat alone at the table tasting air. Then He came in smiling softly and placed a small box before me. I opened it to find a blank leather-bound notebook. Thick, unlined pages. "To rewrite yourself," he said. He didn't ask if I was okay or apologize for the others. He only gave me that notebook as if it was a key. That night, I opened it. I wrote, "I choose me today." I let go of the versions of myself everyone else tried to script. I wrote for hours, sometimes in silence, sometimes with tears dripping into ink. I listed truths I want a love defined by loyalty, not validation. I'm tired of shrinking. I didn't promise to be perfect. I promised to be real. I erased old pictures where I looked smaller. I changed my social media bio to say, author, teacher, partner in mud and metropolis. I posted a photo of us laughing at home, mismatched socks, mismatched life. No caption. I got 5 likes. Enough. I continued writing in that notebook in the coming days, drafting letters I'd never send, chapters I hadn't lived yet. I drew 2 columns, them and us, with a door between. By the end of the week, I circled beneath it, I am allowed to exist out loud. That notebook was my rebellion and my refuge. Friday evening came. We sat at the kitchen table again. He reached across, took my hand and said, "Happy birthday, Eliza." I smiled, the kind of smile that belonged to the woman I was rediscovering. That night, beneath softly humming lights, I felt that fortress inside me settle. I knew letting go didn't have to mean walking away. It could mean holding tight to what mattered and building something beautiful from the silence. The next morning, I found the envelope on the kitchen counter, slightly askew as though inviting me in. I'd shoved 6 emails and work notes onto it, avoiding it all day. But finally, when the dusk draped the windows in lavender, I sat at the kitchen table and pulled it open. Inside were papers. Pages of well-worn legal documents, stock statements, a folder labelled Stone AgTech logos, crossed out with red pen. I felt my breath catch. He had sold the startup. He'd built a company quietly, deliberately, and walked away from fame and headlines. I stared at his name in small font on formation documents, at the numbers flowing like secret rivers. Millions, maybe tens of millions, the kind of wealth that changes everything. But it wasn't the value that made me gulp. It is the silence behind it, the loss, the secrecy, the betrayal. That's when I realised I had married a man who chose to scrub floors, carry mops and ride a maintenance cart in a downtown building because he wanted to disappear. He had hidden because he was hurt. Heartbroken in public before used by people seeking power in his name. He chose obscurity so that he'd never become someone else's trophy or story. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Lana. "Are you okay?" I typed back. "I'm learning who I married." I went into the living room holding the stack of papers. He was home early, standing in the doorway watching me. I could feel the weight of every secret between us and every promise. "I should have told you," he said quietly. His voice was brittle, delicate. "But I wasn't sure you'd want to be part of the person I once was." "Part of you," I said, stunned. I pressed the documents into his hands, tears catching. "I'm not afraid of the man you were. I'm angry at how much pain you carried alone." He jerked back, rubs his hand over his jaw. "Eliza, I've been used. I became someone they envied so they could feel better about themselves. So, when someone like me married someone like you, it became a narrative. You'd have used my story to prove yourself to the world, to your family. And I wasn't ready for that." Tears leaked down my cheeks. "You didn't trust me." His eyes glistened. "I wanted to protect you from me." The room filled with silence, not awkward, but honest. Months drafts of unspoken thought stood in the air between us, ghosting around the edges. I sat down across from him and reached over, entwined my fingers with his. "I've been carrying my own doubts," I said, "but this is different. I promised real, not perfect. And now I see why it took so long." We didn't talk again for a long time, not because of distance, but because trust settled in. I looked at the documents again, feeling both small and powerful. The man I knew and the man behind these documents converged in that moment. A single man with two selves and a bridge between. That night, I cooked him soup, my attempt at nourishment for both of us. He smiled at the table simple candle between us, no words. The clinking spoon and gentle steam felt like forgiveness, like acceptance. I lay in the bed that night listening to his breathing. I thought about everything, the birthday, the notebook, the storm, the envelope. I felt the fortress within me reinforced by something more than self-reliance. It was connection. Because in knowing his past, I got the gift he'd offered me in silence all along. And I realised he didn't need applause. He needed presence just like I did. We fell asleep with our hands still entwined, and I knew the story had changed. Not because the line of sight was sharper, but because I chose to see the man behind the label. Weeks later, Veronica held her company's annual gala, her most polished event, with glass chandeliers dripping light onto polished floors, a cocktail crowd dressed in sleek suits and gowns. The venue buzzed with polite chatter, clinking glasses, pianists coaxing melodies behind white roses. I arrived with James, who wore a crisp blazer over his janitor polo, his uniform sleeve neatly hidden beneath tailored fabric. When we were announced, my heart beat rapidly against calm skin. I walked beside him as if that was the only truth I needed. We passed table after table of executives who once whispered behind their hands, now offering polite nods. Veronica spotted us first, her laugh slicing through the mild applause. She swept over to us radiant and pristine, greeting James with all the poise she'd once used to dismiss him. She introduced us and paused with theatrical grace. The room stilled for a heartbeat. Then came the curveball. One of James's ex-girlfriends, a woman I'd never met, but whose reputation preceded her, drifted near. She held her glass like a challenge. Lips tight, she said loud enough for the nearest diners to hear. "Well, aren't you a catch?" Now must have been good at keeping him heard. Plenty of girls were lined up before. I felt the room shift. A hush dropped. Someone turned. Someone whispered. Feet shifted against floor. My chest tightened like electrodes pressing inward. But I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I inhaled slowly. I looked at her and then at James, his hand found mine, squeezing softly like a tether. I set my glass on the nearby highboy table and said evenly, "Yeah." I held on to him, like he held on to me, didn't let go like the others. My voice carried softly, but carried. No tremors, no accusation, just clarity. The room exhaled. Someone swallowed. Veronica's smile split, uncertainties flickering. You could almost hear the hum of power recalibrating. That moment her mic drop disguised as a polite crowd reaction was the first time I felt something shift. Not only in the room, but inside me. We walked toward the dance floor. The lights glittered, music swelled. A jazz trio played tender notes. I matched James step for step, guided by the weight of his hand. He leaned in and whispered, "That was all you." There was no condescension, only pride, relief. Love softened in his tone. As I looked at him, I realized I truly felt like the winner, not because I'd struck back, but because I held my ground, because enough was more profound than anger, because calm, not fury, reclaimed me. Afterward, when we stepped into the quiet foyer to catch our breath, Veronica joined us. Her face was softened, unsettled. She said, "That line deserved more than applause." She paused, looking at James, then looked at me. I stared back evenly. I nodded. We didn't exchange more words. That was enough. She turned and left, joining the swirl of guests once again. James and I exited through the side door into the cool night. City lights glimmered on wet pavement. We could hear footsteps echoing in the marble lobby behind us. I slipped my hand into his, and we walked toward our car. In silence, my mind replaying the moment over and over, not the words, but how it felt rooted, unwavering, peaceful. At home, he made us hot chocolate. I sat at the kitchen island, tracing the condensation on the mug. I realised the story had tilted rooms that once felt cold, now held warmth. I didn't need vindication from Veronica or her crowd. The mirror between us now reflected something stronger. I reached for his hand across the counter. "You ever think you'd end up here attending her party as my +1? He smiled with a softness I'd never noticed. I thought she'd never ask me near that room again. He paused, then said as he stirred cream into your cup, "But here you are, holding ground. Holding truth." I looked down at my mug. Thought of the envelope and the notebook. I thought of the quiet fortress we'd built, not of silence, but present solidity, and I realised I wasn't stepping back anymore. I was stepping into belonging. We watched black and white shows on TV that night and laughed softly. It felt oddly triumphant, simple, shared space after the storm, and I felt it in my bones. The moment I stood up wasn't dramatic, it was stillness, with strength. Enough is enough, and that's enough. The next week moved quietly. James didn't announce anything, but I noticed changes, a steady trickle of shareholder filings in the newsfeed. Stone AgTech was purchasing shares in Veronica's company. The wording was sterile, board ready, yet the implication was anything but. When I asked why, he said simply, "Labour violations. Misreported hours. It's time." I sat with him one evening, papers spread across the island. There were spreadsheets, memo drafts, internal whistleblower notes he'd received. His fingers hovered above the keyboard, and he paused. I looked him in the eye. "Let me help." He nodded, surprised. Of course. The next day, I pulled old finance textbooks from our shelf, dusted off my highlighter, and reopened the language I'd avoided since college. I drafted a report on wage discrepancies, annotated financial footnotes, cross-referenced labour codes. James watched in the next room, his back to me for a long minute, and then he whispered, "I didn't know you'd do this." I closed my laptop. "I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for me." Lana stopped by, unannounced, at the apartment that afternoon. I was at the table with spreadsheets and company reports coffee cooling. She stared. Her eyebrow arched. "Trying to be a CFO now, huh? Look at you, full Wall Street vibes." Her voice coated with sarcasm. I didn't flinch. I looked up and said evenly, "I'm trying to see what I helped build. That's all." She rolled her eyes, scoffed, then left. That evening, Hank knocked at the door, the older janitor who'd once worked next to James. He carried a thin stack of books, idea volumes, biographies of engineers, metaphor-laced philosophy tomes. He said these helped him think. "Maybe they help you too." I accepted them, shaking his hand. His voice was soft but steady. "Truth is often seeded in dirt. You plant, you wait." The metaphor sank in labour truth growth. Over the next days, I spent hours reading drafting editing reports. I spoke with Veronica's former mentor, a woman who trained under her years ago. She'd seen patterns repeat, cut corners, hidden hours, threshold reporting just beneath audits. When I approached her, she looked sorrowful. Veronica was brilliant, once she said, but not ethical. I can't support that anymore. She handed me internal documents that confirmed everything. She became our quiet ally. Then came the shareholder, vote a board meeting, organised only for the people with majority or plurality shares. The room hummed with high-powered investors in heavy suits. Veronica sat at one corner of the raised dais, expression cool, polished smile. James and I entered, quietly laptop cases, in hand-press passes unavailable. The air shifted, investors noted us, whispers rose. Eliza's notes sat on the table. I passed them around casually to one ally who nodded. We didn't speak loudly, but our quiet presence conveyed gravity. Those silent stakeholders, the documents, the votes, the steady purchase of shares spoke louder than any protest. When Eliza's report on the wage irregularities and labour infractions got read aloud, the noise of legal liability echoed in the room before a single word was spoken. Veronica's face tightened. Her mentor's presence in the gallery glowed her subtle nod. Hank's metaphor came full circle, the seed beneath the dirt emerging in bloom. After the vote, Veronica had to concede a board seat. The company would appoint an ethics committee staffed partly by James and Eliza's allies. She came off the dais and approached us, face rigid but softer at the eyes. She offered a half bow. Her words were clipped. What you did was substantial. Congratulations. No flourish, no apology, just acknowledgement. James placed a steady hand on my back. I exhaled and looked around. Lana messaged, wow. Eliza typed back, yeah. That night, James walked me home. No fanfare, just two people who'd stood in rooms full of whispers and left them with quiet steps. We climbed the stairs and paused by the door. I looked at him and said, we did this. And he squeezed my hand as if to say yes. Quietly, this was us. Inside, we sat at the table again, on edge, breathing the aftertaste of victory. I opened the door to Hank's stack of books, took one and read the dedication. To those who build strength from silence. I smiled and said, that's our story. He kissed my temple and whispered, our silent work still reflects in every corner of that room. That night, I wrote in my notebook, not by volume, but by volume of presence, we reclaim spaces. Then I closed it and sat beside him in the dark, knowing we'd built something real. The boardroom was bathed in soft daylight, a studio of steel and glass towering over city streets. Veronica sat at the head table, her posture sculpted and perfect. Investors fanned out in rows, eyes fixed on the dais or on the rumours swirling behind us. I stood quietly beside James at the far end, laptop in hand, our presence subtle but indelible. When the vote tally was confirmed, James rose. The room fell quiet. He cleared his throat and spoke softly, deliberately. I'd like to address the board. His voice carried no swagger, just truth. Veronica's face tightened, her lips pinched into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. What game are you playing? She fired, voice brittle. He didn't flinch. He pushed his blazer higher and looked directly at her. This isn't a game, he said. It's accountability. She inhaled, caught off guard. Her eyes flashed. Investors leaned forward, shuffling papers. I stayed still, watching the shift in the air. I stepped forward with the printed documents, wage infractions, attendance logs, anonymous complaints. As I handed them to the secretary, I heard the silence swell. Then I said softly, you once told me at our wedding I was the extra. But now you kneel before someone you never looked at properly. My voice took on calm power. Not spite, just clarity. Veronica's face went pale. Her jaw trembled. She lifted her laptop to close it, hand shaking so badly it snapped shut. It made a small click in the hush of the room. She attempted to fold it neatly, but the motion looked clumsy, unpracticed. No one moved for a beat, no applause, no raised voices. Her colleagues stared, papers rustled, investors pressed for confirmation. There were no cheers, just the weight of written truth. She packed with slow, precise movements. No apology, no tearful explanations. She gathered her belongings with trembling fingers and stood. No one talked her down. No hand reached out. She walked away. Her heels clicked across polished tile, and the sound seemed outdated, lonely. It drifted toward the exit, nearly empty, echoing faintly, until swallowed by the door's soft swing. Veronica didn't look at me, didn't look at James, didn't glance once. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't say anything, and not one person stood to stop her. The boardroom remained silent long after she left, silence heavy, relentless. I turned to James, his hands clasped lightly at our table. I lifted mine slowly to rest on his wrist. It was a breath between us. An investor who'd quietly followed me at one meeting glanced over and nodded brief tight. A display of acknowledgement. Veronica's mentor seated behind us lifted her gaze. No remorse in her eyes. Sadness, maybe. And something like victory restrained by dignity. Inside Veronica's psyche was unraveling. For the first time, no one feared her. Her empire of control crumbled under minutes of evidence. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't wielded power. She didn't need to. Truth did the dismantling. Silence tasted like dust where influence once thrived. Afterwards, James and I exited the room quietly, our footsteps soft as if not wanting to disturb echoes. We walked in parallel silence because loudness wasn't necessary. We had presence. Outside, midday sunlight softened when we reached the lobby. I paused and looked at him, steady, calm, present. He nodded and said nothing. That moment felt triumphant, not because of skepticism or celebration, but because of grounded gentleness. A few guests, shareholders, interns watched us leave. Some sent recognizing glances. Some whispered, "Was that her?" But we walked on unhurried, unafraid. Later, we caught an elevator together, just the two of us. No chatter. Our shoulders brushed as the doors closed. It felt like falling into gravity, quiet, inevitable. That night, at home, I flipped through my notebook. I wrote one line. Truth enters not with volume, but unshakable presence. I paused. I wrote another, no one feared her anymore, and then I closed it. We poured tea in the kitchen. He passed a mug to me. I took a slow sip. The aftertaste was sweetness sprinkled with resolution walls, undone new space made. We sat side by side in the quiet living room that night. Black and white TV shows flickered over us again, but this time I felt the weight of what had transpired. This wasn't drama, it wasn't revenge, it was justice carried out through documents, witness, and quiet conviction. At bedtime, I lay beside him, watching his breathing, steady in the dark. I realised the twist wasn't revenge. It was the industry he built, hidden, quiet, ethical, becoming the weapon. No dramatic confrontation, no theatrics, just legal filings and silent purchasing. Veronica had lost authority because her foundation was compromised, not through protests, but through accountability. The moment she lost the grip was the moment truth became stakeholder, and there was nothing left to defend. I slept soundly that night, not because I was triumphant, but because I belonged to someone honest and he belonged to me wholly. Our shared fortress of presence had prevailed. The next morning, the company-wide email appeared in my inbox within minutes of the board's publication. From today, no one is judged by their title. That was my message to them. Signature Eliza Stone, VP of Ethics and Corporate Culture. Veronica's name came underneath mine in the organisational chart, no longer leading anything but working at a lower tier. She had been demoted, stripped of her executive title, effectively weakened in the very empire she built. I didn't celebrate. Instead, I paused at the announcement, letting the words sink in across our digital workplace. In the days since the board meeting, we had reorganised. Veronica stayed on staff, no house thrown at her. But as an employee under the new ethics committee alongside others, James and I helped appoint. I wasn't there to punish, but to rebuild, ensuring policies protected workers, restoring transparency, shifting power out of petty hierarchies. When I first stepped into our newly repurposed conference room, once Veronica's office, I saw engraved plaques being removed, corporate slogans replaced with blank whiteboards. I touched the smooth wooden table, trying to feel the energy of change rather than resentment. This was not conquest. It was correction. Later that afternoon, an email landed from Aunt Margaret. Short, sharp. You're talented, but ungrateful. You owe more loyalty to family than ambition. The window blinked red beside the unread fill icon. I stared at it for a moment. It stung not because it was true, but because she still thought she knew what mattered. I didn't reply. I just hovered over the delete icon, then sent it to the done folder, where it would sit unread. At lunch, I went to the rooftop garden with James. He gave me a gentle look. Family politics. I nodded, picking at my salad. I didn't want this, I whispered. He slipped an arm around me. You didn't create the conflict, Eliza. You just decided it needed change. Back at my desk, I opened the email again. I thought of Veronica, demoted but still within our walls. I thought of Aunt Margaret and the worldview I had refused to buy. I thought of the soul of the company, now resting in board members we trust, policies I helped write, and people whose voices we'd amplified. That evening, I drafted a follow-up email to the company. Effective immediately, all staff, regardless of title or tenure, will be encouraged to file suggestions, concerns, and observations to a new ethics portal. Every submission will be reviewed openly. We begin this cycle of transparency not with grand gestures, but with small, consistent actions. I paused before hitting send, thinking of the silent fortress from my notebook. Presence, not position. I clicked. A ripple went out. The next day, Veronica walked past me in the hallway. She hesitated only a moment. She stopped. Her face was composed, pale but open. She said softly, I'll cooperate. No apology, no flourish, just a statement. I nodded, accepting her words as the beginning, not the end. Moments later, Lana walked in, coffee cup in hand. She eyed me, eyebrow raised. Then she said, You've done more in a week than most do in years. I smiled. She smiled back softly. That was enough. That evening, I returned home to find a note slipped under the door. It wasn't from family or work. It was from a former janitorial staff I had never met, but whose letter began, Thank you for what you're doing. We needed someone like you. My chest tightened. That was the kind of validation I wanted, not from status, but from truth. That night, James and I sprawled on the couch, a documentary humming softly from the screen. I rested my head on his shoulder and felt the evening settle around us. I thought of the fortress we'd built not of stone or brick, but of integrity and shared presence. I opened my notebook again, and wrote at the top of a fresh page, "Trust is the currency that rebuilds culture." Then I underlined it twice. As I closed that book and looked at him, I realised the title I held VP of Ethics and Corporate Culture wasn't vanity. It was responsibility. And I was ready. A few days later, an email landed in my inbox with no subject line, just an attachment. My heart skipped. The sender was Veronica. Inside was a neatly typed letter on company letterhead. I closed my eyes before opening it. She wrote about their childhood together, how she felt obligated to sacrifice her dreams for mine, taking jobs, turning away scholarships, always being the family caretaker. She spoke of carrying our mother's emotional burden of guilt that shaped her ambition. She asked if I could forgive her for being the golden child, for turning ambition into armour, and for using me as proof of her success. My breath caught at how raw it sounded. I finished reading and sat in the dawn light streaming across the page. I folded the printed sheet with deliberate calm. I slipped it into my personal filing drawer, separate from everything else. I didn't reply. I didn't delete it. It was evidence that wounds existed, but I also didn't forward or respond. It wasn't for others to see. It was hers to carry, and mine to let go. That evening, Veronica's name appeared again at the top of another email this time. Only her words, "I'm sorry I ever made you doubt yourself." But there was no letter, just that line alone. My finger hovered. Then, clicking delete, I watched her name disappear from my inbox entirely. Later that night, we sat in the stillness of our apartment. I leaned into his shoulder, breathing slowly. I let out a soft sigh and said, "Let's get ramen tomorrow. I want the window seat." There was no review of the past between us, no lingering echoes, just that invitation, a signal that we were moving forward. He smiled around the corner of his noodles. "You always pick the window seat." I nodded. My chest felt light. It was enough to know I choose peace over explanation. That night, we didn't speak of the letters, the demotion, the storm, or the betrayal. We spoke of nothing and felt everything. In the following days, I noticed my own reflection shift. Instead of rereading messages I might never answer or emailing back with explanations, I just let them sit, quietly resolved. I didn't ask to be understood. I just understood myself enough. Work flowed. My role deepened not with grandstanding, but with presence. I spoke at staff meetings, not as someone who won, but as someone who had learned that letting go of past judgment allowed us to focus on future integrity. Colleagues told me later their respect had come not from power plays, but from that quiet centre not needing an answer, but being steady. One afternoon, Lana popped in. She traced a finger along my notebook edge. I lifted the cover. "Inside the latest entry, I forgive not because you deserve it, but because I don't need to carry it anymore." She nodded slowly. She placed a hand on my shoulder. Then she quietly closed my door and walked back to her office. No sarcasm, just compassion. A few days later, Veronica passed me in the hallway. She stopped. For a moment I thought she'd turn and leave. She looked at me and said softly, "Good work." That was it. No apologies. But I felt her words as respect. I nodded and smiled. I watched her move on. That moment ended our tether not violently, but neutrally. We existed in the same space without collision. That night, I opened the notebook again and wrote, "Not needing validation. Cherche freedom." I closed it and set it beside me. He came and sat down. I didn't need to explain why I chose the window seat again. He poured us tea and we moved toward the couch. He draped a blanket over us. I rested my head on his shoulder. And there was peace. Our fortress was not built from loud victories or revenge. It was built of silence, presence, and emotional ownership. I sleep each night, now unhurried, certain. Not because I have the perfect life, but because I stopped needing to defend it. And in forgiving, without fanfare, I freed myself. I forgave not because she deserved it, but because I deserve peace. That was the real ending to this chapter. The next morning, I arrived at the creative writing classroom, 20 minutes early, the sunlight pooling on the linoleum floor. I set up my laptop, cleared the desks into neat clusters, and placed 2 mugs on the back table tin terracotta orange cups that looked out of place in the modern university setting. One for me, one for whatever student showed up early. I stared out the window, watching cherry blossoms tumble through the breeze, petals drifting like confessions whispered into still air. A student raised their hand, not hesitating, not performing for the class. "Ms. Stone, have you ever felt like a failure?" the moment hung in the quiet room. My fingers paused above the keyboard. I looked at her not as a teacher, but as someone remembering. I nodded slightly. "Yes, I have. More times than I can count." The room leaned in. She waited. I felt smaller after a wedding, after family gatherings, after people made up stories about me. I felt like I was that empty chair at a party, visible but unwelcome. I paused, breathing in the memory as though inhaling smoke. But then I realized if I stay silent, who will rewrite my story? I clicked a slide that read, "Your voice matters." Not because others demand it, but because it exists. Students scribbled. A murmur of resonance passed through the room. That afternoon, they submitted a short essay about family. Most were polite. One girl submitted early. Her essay detailed how her parents had worked multiple jobs they'd been judged by others because they didn't have proper degrees, proper clothes, proper vacation photos. She wrote, "I felt they were embarrassed of us. I kept secrets at school. I erased the details of our life. I typed a reply in the margin, 'You don't have to protect them. Just choose them every day.'" I sat back. That line felt like a promise I'd made to myself months ago. Not to erase the past, but to choose what matters, presence, loyalty, connection. Later, I packed my notebook and my laptop into a slim satchel. The sun shone outside. I unlocked the door to the hallway. Students trickled in. I greeted a handful on the way out. I stepped into the corridor lined with glass walls and posters of literary writers. I almost expected a rehearsal of projection success and status, but instead it felt ordinary, open. No hush followed me. I walked down the steps and through the front lobby doors. The air was crisp outside morning sound, unfurled, car doors, cell phone chirps, pedestrians on their way. I saw Veronica at the corner of the walkway, carrying a clipboard and wearing a badge with her new title at the company staff relations. She looked professional, contained, not resentful. I paused. She looked up, soft eyes. For a moment I considered anything, but then I kept walking. No bitterness, no bow, no glance thrown my way. When I reached the sidewalk, James stood with 2 takeaway coffees in his hands, one for me, one for himself. He smiled, fresh and grounded. I accepted mine. He slipped the lid on mine carelessly, then stepped toward me. We began walking side by side on the university plaza, cherry trees overhead, wind-soft petals dancing at our feet. This was home, not a stage. I didn't say it out loud, but I felt it. I didn't need anyone's validation now. I didn't need applause or explanation. I just wouldn't ask permission to be myself anymore. Every footfall across the courtyard felt intentional. Every choice of lane, every glance forward instead of backward, tiny rebellions of belonging. Veronica moved through this space too, but no longer in hierarchy beside me. She was there as an employee, same world, changed shape. We passed her desk area as we left the building, a common area near the lobby. She looked briefly my way. Not a bow, not a nod, but not contempt either. A neutral acknowledgement. That was enough. That moment closed the loop. I sipped from my coffee, cream dark warmth. James took my hand. The campus stretched around us, pulsing with life. I looked at him and let the quiet in the only permission that mattered now was my own. The next class I taught, I read from Emily Dickinson's letters, I Dwell in Possibility, and I told them, you don't need someone to open the door. You can walk through your own. They leaned in. They nodded. That afternoon, I wrote a final note in my notebook, my own version of the brightest signature. I don't need anyone's validation. I just won't ask permission to be me. Underneath, I drew a door with no hinges. I closed the cover softly. At home, James asked, "That last class seemed different." I said, "It was. I wasn't teaching them how to edit stories. I was teaching them to live them." He looked at me like I had rewritten something he thought was done. He kissed the side of my head and said, "Mine just got better." That night, I slept without rehearsing the past or anticipating future apologies. I slept with him beside me, steady breathing in rhythm with mine. In the quiet that followed, I knew I had written the most important chapter of my life, not for recognition, not for revenge, but simply because I finally gave myself the pen. And maybe if you're listening to this while staring at a ceiling that feels too familiar, wondering if you're too late, too small, too invisible to matter, this part is for you. You don't need someone else to acknowledge your worth before you begin. You don't have to wait until the room gets quiet. You are allowed to exist out loud, even if no one claps, even if no one apologizes. Healing, I've found, isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's a slow exhale, a single truth written in a notebook, a morning where you choose to get up without proving anything. More and more people I meet are choosing quiet healing through journaling, through long walks, through letting go of the need to be understood. They're rewriting themselves gently, not because someone told them to, but because the silence became heavy and they decided they deserved more. If this story made you feel seen even a little, I hope you carry that with you. And if you have a story of your own, something you've survived, something you're still walking through, drop it in the comments. You never know who needs to hear it. And if you want to stay for more stories like this, the kind that don't shout but still linger, consider subscribing. No pressure, just presence. You are not too late. You are not too broken. And you don't need anyone's permission to begin again.